We're going to get started. Thank you all so much for coming. We still have more walking in. I can hear you all are so excited. I don't know if anything on that side of the room helped or not, but thank you all for coming. We're just as excited as you are. I am Gina Duvernay, the Adult Services Manager for Gwinnett County Public Library, and on behalf of the library, I just want to thank you all for coming and joining us and spending your evening with us. We had a screen down earlier. I hope you were able to take a glance. We have other author events coming up. We would love to see your beautiful faces join us again for any of those. I want to just point out a few things this evening before we get started. Of course, we have Karis Bookstore, who we're so happy to have with us tonight, who have sold you all these beautiful books. The covers are amazing. They're just so gorgeous. So please, if you've already purchased one book, but there are several others, they're there for you all evening, and you can grab them as you wish. We also have, of course, our wine bar, and we have refreshments. Anytime you want to grab any, please do, because if you don't, then we'll have to eat them. I think we can make it work, but I would rather you do it. So I'm just going to get started. I'm going to bring out Merwin Chambers, who is the face of the Friends of the Library, along with his beautiful wife, Corliss. Corliss, wave to everybody. Yes, I'm going to bring him out, and he's going to introduce our moderator and our author of the evening. Before he does that, though, I do want to thank, again, Karis Bookstore in the back. I want to thank the Friends of the Library for putting this all together for us. Amy Perry in the back, she's with Gwinnett County Public Library, and Miriam Mayer somewhere around, the two ladies in the front. Oh, they're out in the back. I mean, lots of work went into this, so thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. So Merwin is going to take us away and speak to you about the Friends of the Library and introduce our speakers for the evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gina. As Gina said, my name is Merwin Chambers. I am treasurer of the Friends of the Gwinnett County Public Library. The Friends work to promote the library system, and we work with the library staff to help put on events such as this one tonight, and also other programs as requested. If you're not currently a member, I do encourage you to join. The Friends is sponsoring tonight's refreshments and silent auction. The proceeds from the silent auction go back to the library when we have to rent spaces such as this to have these events. Successful bidders will be announced at the close of tonight's program. The program is being filmed, as you can see, and will be on the library's YouTube channel in a few weeks. Moderating tonight's event is Duffie Dixon. Duffie is a multiple Emmy Award-winning communications and media specialist. She is Director of Marketing and Communications for the Gwinnett County Public Library. Duffie is a familiar face to many of us around Metro Atlanta. She was an on-air reporter for 11 Alive News for more than a decade. In her beloved New York Times bestsellers, such as Dreams of Joy and China Doll, Lisa C. brilliantly illuminated the immigrant experience and the bonds among women. Her first book, On Gold Mountain, the 100-Year Odyssey of My Chinese American Family, traces the journey of her great-grandfather, Fan Si, who overcame obstacles at every step to become a 100-year-old grandfather of Los Angeles' Chinatown, as well as the patriarch of a sprawling family. Lisa's latest book, Lady Tan's Circle of Women, a captivating novel inspired by the true story of a woman physician from 15th century China, who, despite the confinements of women at that time, treated women and girls from every level of society, and led a life of such importance that many of her remedies are still being used today. Ms. C was the Publishers Weekly West Coast correspondent for 13 years, and her articles have appeared in Vogue, Self, and more. Please join me in welcoming Duffie and Lisa to the stage.
We should have talked about that. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Great crowd. Before we start, I was going to ask how many of you have read the book we're going to talk about, Lady Tan's Circle of Women? Okay, and then most of you got the book, so you read after this. Okay, so we promise we'll talk about the book, but no spoilers, okay? Because I don't like it when it happens to me. You good? So we are so thrilled to have you here. This is huge. I'm a huge fan of yours personally, but I know that many of us have journeyed with you and read a lot of your books. This one, I love the story of how this book came about. Can you explain it? Because it's just the coolest thing.
Sure, but first, I just want to say I'm so happy to be here. This was originally planned for 2020, and then we postponed and we had another date, and then there was a surge or something. So third time's the charm. And I just have to say one other thing, which is I was talking to my husband on the phone last night when I arrived here, and he is never impressed by anything I do, really. I mean, you know, like, oh, honey, the book's on the New York Times bestsellers. He's saying, oh, that's nice, honey. But when I told him where he was like, Gwinnett County, you mean John King Magic Board, you know? And so he was just like, even this morning he called me and he was just like, can you believe that you're there? And this is, and how we all know about it. And we were like, what do you think it's like for them every election season? He was, oh, the ads they must get. So, yeah, so.
I guess we're about to get more ads. It's
I'm
never
sure.
a long enough stretch between.
Yeah, you must be inundated by them. But anyway, you're famous all over the country for you know, being on the magic board.
You know, we do a lot of other cool things.
Yes, I'm sure. Well, in my household, this really impressed my husband, so thank you. All right, so how did this book came to be? Well, actually, we do have to go back to the pandemic. That first year, I thought I knew what the next book was going to be. I do think about books for a very long time before I decide this is the one. For Island of Sea Women, I thought about that book for 8 years.
Wow.
For Tea Girl of Hummingbird Lane, it was 20 years before I had my way in. And I thought I knew what the next book was going to be after Island of Sea Women. I'd slowly been collecting material. I went out on book tour for the paperback of Island of Sea Women on March 10th, 2020. I went to 5 states in 5 days, and then the whole tour was canceled. You know, I was sent home, the country shut down, the world shut down, and there I was, home alone with my husband. 24 hours a day.
A lot of us felt that way. We won't go into it, but yeah.
But I mean, it was
a lot of time together.
And one thing we all learned was who was essential and who wasn't. Like most of us were not essential, especially writers, it turns out. Yeah. Anyway, I was just home alone, and I couldn't work on that book that I'd been planning because it was going to require a trip deep, deep, deep into the interior of China, a very, very remote part of China. No way to do it then. Even now, I'd be a little reluctant about going anywhere in the world that remote. And all of the archives and libraries and research libraries that I've used, all of them were closed, and in fact did remain closed for the entire writing of this book. But there I was, home alone, and I always hate to admit this because I sound so melodramatic about it, but I had this feeling of like, well, my life is over.
Yeah, but
you know, and I can't do the things I do. I can't go to China. I can't go to the research library. I can't do anything. And I was just really moping around, and you know, several months in, I bought my first ever pair of pajamas. I mean, it was, you know, it was going like that. It was just. And then it was all the way in October, so a lot of months had gone by, and I was just walking through my office, and I have a huge wall of all my research books, and the spine of one of them jumped out at me, and I don't know why, because it was just a light gray jacket with slightly darker gray lettering, nothing to jump out, but it did. And I pulled it down, Reproducing Women, Pregnancy and Childbirth in the Ming Dynasty. I opened it up. I'd had it on my shelf for 10 years and had never opened it. But I thought to myself, well, here we are in the middle of a pandemic. My life is over. I guess this is the time to start reading it. And so I sat down right then and started reading. I got to page 19, and there was a mention of a woman doctor, Tan Yunxian, who in the Ming Dynasty, right there, pretty amazing, 500 years ago, a woman doctor, who, when she turned 50 in 1511, published a book of her medical cases. And I thought, oh, this is kind of interesting. And I set the book down. I went to my computer. I looked her up. And in fact, her book was still in print, not just in Chinese, but also in English. And so although I am a huge supporter of independent bookstores, my entire tour has been 100% independent bookstores. On that day, I might have ordered from,
the A word.
And I had the book in 24 hours. So instead of thinking about something for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, this was all of about 26 hours.
I asked you earlier, but when we're talking about how long ago this was, the Ming Dynasty, it starts in the early 1400s.
Yeah.
Is this the farthest back you've gone?
For sure, it's the furthest back. I think the other one the next one would be Peony in Love, which was in the 17th century. And we did talk a little bit behind the curtain, but in some ways, having a book set that far back in time is easier because nobody knows what was going on then. But on the other hand, I have to know what was going on then. Right. And so there were things in this book, I do a tremendous amount of research, and I do get to a point where I think I've done all the research, I'm ready to go, and then I start writing and something will pop up like, I needed somebody to write a letter. Did they have a mail system in the Ming Dynasty? I mean, who knew? And so I reached out to some different scholars, and they kept sending me to other scholars, and then finally someone said, oh yes, I know someone who has done all of his research for like the last 40 years on the history of the Ming Dynasty mail system.
There's always someone, you just have to find them.
And you have to find them.
And you found him.
And I did. And so there were things like that pop up, and just other things like this, and you can tell from the cover of the book, these hair ornaments, the hairstyle, but a lot of makeup. How did they make that makeup? What was in those hair ornaments? What did they mean? How did you separate, what a servant might wear to what an elite woman or even like the empress would wear, and what did those things mean, not just sort of economically, but also like what were the meanings within the clothes, within the designs, within the little ornaments themselves.
Ever since I've read that book, I finished it last week. It starts off, and you just have such a good way with words, but she describes, as it has been told to her, the stages of a woman's life. And I will tell you, it's kind of depressing because if you remember them off, I don't want to put you on the spot, and I should have written it down, but they are, and it really, you follow these stages as they happen. But nowadays, when people are living to be 80 and 90, you think, you basically at 50, they're like, okay, you're going.
Well, actually, I sort of almost have to disagree with you there, because to me there were so many similarities between the stages of a woman's life then and even
they
now.
are. Oh, they're still very true.
The milk teeth days when you're a little kid. Then you have hairpinning days, where this is, in that time to sort of signify that you were ready for marriage, how you put up your hair. But I think we also still have that in a sense of, whether you decide to get married or not, but, sort of when you're a teenager till about when you're 25, somewhere in there, you're out and about and you're looking so good and everything. And then rice and salt days, those days of family and chores, and I mean, I felt that. There's that chapter that starts part 3 of the book where I just follow Tan Yunxian through a day. And that day just made me so tired.
Right.
But I also really remembered days like that for myself when my kids were young. You know, and I think we, you know, especially if you've had kids and you know, and you're keeping the whole enterprise going, you know that there's just a tremendous amount of work. Plus, if you're working, you know, outside as well. And then they had what was called sitting quietly. And this was, you know, you're really after menopause and you're just supposed to sit quietly and wait for death.
Well, that's the thing. I was like, sit quietly that early? I mean, we have one more chapter in there.
And of course, she completely defied that. But I think most
did.
women do, you know, and I don't know that there was ever really a time. I mean, of course, people do live longer now. She did live to be 96. So that's a remarkable age today, really remarkable in the time that she lived. Might show that she was a pretty good doctor. But she had a lot, you know, of life still ahead of her, which she filled with her work and with family. And I don't know, I just felt like there were so many, that she saw that as a freeing up time to pursue, like she didn't have to bother. Can I say this on your TV? Yeah. She didn't have to bother with bed business with her husband anymore. You know, she was just sort of like, I've got other stuff to do, Joe. You know? And so, you know, I kind of appreciated that about her, that she was like, okay, now I've done all the things I'm supposed to do for the family and for you, and now I'm going to go do my stuff.
Focus on medicine. And it, you know, with many of your books, you talk about the traditions and the cultural norms and the role of women, and yet you find these characters who, it's not just on their own, they have like an inkling that they want to sort of buck the trend, but then you put people in their lives that really sort of speak against what is expected. Not that she's ever rude or disobeys what she's supposed to do, but she gets people to help her sort of do things she's probably not supposed to do. So tell me, the earliest influence for me, her mom when she's quite young, but then she also has these grandparents. These grandparents were just, those two characters were amazing. They were so ahead of their time.
Yeah. And her grandparents, I mean, this is a true story, right? And so in her book, there are these prefaces and some afterwards written by male relatives, and then she also wrote a pretty long introduction that really talks about her own life, and particularly about her grandparents. And her grandfather was a retired imperial scholar. You know, she had a whole generations of imperial scholars in her family, and that when he retired, he decided he would become a literati doctor, a doctor who's learned how to become a doctor by reading books. I don't think I'd want to go to him.
Yes, it's her grandmother.
But it's her grandmother who's a hereditary doctor.
Right.
And she learned from her parents, who learned from their parents, and so on. And so it's really her grandmother who taught her so much. But I don't think it would have happened if her grandfather hadn't put the idea out there first. So apparently at night he liked to drink wine, what grandpa doesn't, and drink wine and have her recite poetry. This was when she was 8 years old. And I'm gonna have to paraphrase this, but he said something like, you know, this girl is too smart just to be reciting poetry and doing embroidery. She should learn my medicine, meaning, you know, his. But it was really then his wife, Tan Yunxian's grandmother, who really taught her. And of course, her patients were women. So then Yunxian's patients were women and girls as well.
Let's talk about this because it is about her grandmother who treated women, just women, and that healthcare for women was just so archaic. Again, it's the 1400s, I know, but it really is shocking considering women were having babies, women were working, you know, very hard, laborious jobs. But when it came time for medical care, it really was so scarce.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of a contradiction in there because traditional Chinese medicine has been around for 2,000 years. If you think of the 1500s in Europe, you know, you would not have wanted to go to one of those doctors either. You know, it was really, you know, and even, you know, it's just always good to remember that the whole field of obstetrics only really began about 100 years ago. You know, so this is still a relatively fresh field in medicine. And, but in China, and in traditional Chinese medicine until very recently, male doctors could not be in the same room with their female patients, you know, whether it was a little girl or a woman. And so the doctor would be behind a curtain or a screen, or better yet, out in the hall. And his, you know, this little girl's father or a woman's husband would be the one who would go back and forth asking, you know, the doctor would say, here's my question. The husband would run over there, get the answer, come back. Okay, here's the next question. Now, I really love my husband and sons a lot, but I don't want them to be the go-between between, you know.
We all know what happens with a bad game of telephone.
Yeah.
We're talking a medical condition here.
Yeah.
We don't,
And very private stuff.
Yeah.
Really private stuff. So the thing with her and her grandmother was she could actually be in the room with the woman. She could see, was she pale? Was she flushed? Did she have a rash? Was she swollen? She could smell her if she smelled sick, if something smelled off. She could feel her pulses. In traditional Chinese medicine, there are 26 pulses. And so, you know, a male doctor couldn't be in the same room, only if a woman was really at death's door. And then they'd wrap her wrist in several layers of cloth and, you know, stick it out through the curtain, and he would try to feel these pulses through these layers of cloth. But she could put her fingers right on a woman and feel this. But most important, she could talk to a woman straight face to face. And she herself, you know, had been through every phase of a woman's life. So she had been a little girl, she'd gone through puberty, she'd given birth to 4 children, she entered, you know, the glorious gift of menopause. I mean, she had all of that experience herself in her own body. But as we know, and I think know more and more today, the influence of emotions on well-being. And so she could talk to a woman about her sorrows, her tragedies, her anger, her resentments, her jealousy, her envy, where you know, that woman would never have had that possibility with a male doctor.
And those weren't even really discussions that happen with men in their lives either.
No. And I would say even today, there are a lot of doctors who would like go running if you started talking about some of that stuff.
Yeah. When we're talking about the book and this young girl, and she's very young, she doesn't have her mom for very long, spoiler. So she really doesn't have a woman figure, but she does, as I said, she did have people throughout her life. The part about her friend, is that, now are we getting to fiction?
That is fiction.
You always, I think, many times you talk a lot about female friendships.
Right.
And this one is just really interesting because in society, they really never would have been able to be friends.
No.
Explain that.
Yeah, so first can I just talk a little bit about friendship and why I write about it? So I am a woman. I'm looking out, most of you, but not all of you, are women, most of you. I have written about mothers and daughters and sisters and friends, and I do keep coming back to friendship because it is a very particular kind of intimacy. You know, we will tell a friend something that we wouldn't tell our boyfriend, our lover, our husband, our mother, our children. You know, it's very, very particular. And of course, whenever your heart is open like that, you're open to being really hurt. You're vulnerable. And so on the one side, you have all the support and love and understanding that you get from friendship. But I also, wherever I see those sort of dark, shadowy corners, that's where I want to go. That's where I want to go peeking. And because I think all of us have experienced those different types of betrayals and hurt. Now, for Mei Ling, she is training to be a midwife. Yunxian is training to be a doctor. So in those days, and again, until very recently in China, doctors could not touch blood. And so, anything that had to do with blood was left to the midwife. And Confucius, and he had kind of created a hierarchy of professions. And at the very, very bottom were people who came in contact with blood: butchers, coroners, midwives, people who actually got blood on their hands. And so I wanted to explore that, those two things, but also that idea of how women, it doesn't matter where we live in the world, what time period we live in the world, we are all connected by our biology and our physiology. And that it's one thing to be a doctor, but it was something else to be actually bringing life into the world, even if that was considered, filthy and polluted. And so the idea of bringing these two girls together, of course, I love to write about friendship, but to be able to sort of think about these concepts of medicine and society in that time, but also thinking about where women were on this kind of continuum, whether you were a working woman or a servant or a lady in waiting or a concubine or a wife or even the empress.
Their relationship does have some pain in it on both sides.
Yeah.
And one of the study guide questions that I looked up said, who benefited more from that relationship, or how did they benefit? That was a good question to me. I feel like they both did. I feel like they each got something from the other, and
right.
they're pretty specific about when they first become friends, they each want something from each other.
They do.
And it's the girl's mom, the friend's mom, who brings them together and says, I think you two girls should be friends. And it's sort of like, really? How is that ever going to work?
The grandmother.
It was the grandmother.
What is the grandmother thinking?
The grandmother, you're right.
And that these two girls could benefit from each other.
Yeah, and they're very different people. They normally would not interact whatsoever.
Right, Yunxian has bound feet, Mei Ling has, unbound large feet. Right there, that's just such a class distinction. Plus this whole thing of getting, blood on your hands. But I think that the grandmother, we did have this little bit of a spoiler. It's not a big one. Her mother dies at the end of chapter 1. So let's just get that out of the way.
She could have run away.
She's just at the end of chapter 1. And so in some ways, she's kind of orphaned.
Yeah.
And I do feel that in many ways, the story is, there's a reason it's called Lady Tan's Circle of Women. It's like her journey, not just to find that circle, but to actually discover that it's been there all along. Mm-hmm. And that she has these people at different points in her life who really come and do help her, but also, as you said, help her do things that she probably shouldn't be doing. But that friendship, it is a true friendship, but they both at the very beginning want something from the other person. And I think that kind of carries through until finally they realize, forget that sort of trading back and forth where we're both benefiting. There are things that are much deeper that we're getting from this relationship.
So Lady Tan comes from, as you said, a very, very educated family. The
very elite.
Very elite. And the men go off, study for huge degrees and positions. They don't come back home. They're gone forever. They're scholars. They travel the land. So, they are the top echelon. And surprisingly, I think a lot of us think, ooh, if I had all the money in the world, I'd have such freedom. It actually is the complete opposite. When you're a woman in these homes, you don't get to see anyone or anything.
Right.
Describe that.
Yeah, so, families like that would live in one of these big compound homes where you'd be living with, let's just say, 40 to 100 of your husband's relatives.
Your in-laws, your mother-in-law.
Plus, like, the other 99 people.
Right, exactly.
My idea of hell.
And you have to get along.
Yeah, and you have to get along. And this was also a time when these kind of Confucian ideals were infusing society, culture, family. And he had these very specific ideas, I mean, he was a great thinker, don't get me wrong, and a wonderful philosopher, don't get me wrong, but he really didn't care much for women. I think that's fair to say. So sayings like, a good woman should never go more than 3 steps beyond her front gate. And so that, if you're going to be a doctor, for example, how do you do that if you can't go more than 3 steps beyond? And so one of those trades at the beginning is Mei Ling wants to learn how to read, but Yunxian wants to hear about the outside world. And here's this girl who on the surface has nothing. She's very poor. She's learning to do this profession that's seen as polluted and polluting. And yet she gets to go to the festivals, she gets to go to the stand to have different treats to eat, she gets to go to she sees the world in a way that these elite women and girls could not.
And it's sort of so true by nature that the thing you're told you can't see or can't do, that was what she wanted so much to be able to do that. She gets married quite young, which was very common then. Tell me a little bit about getting married during that time period and what that was like. It's scary. But it's also so beautiful and ceremonial and other things like that. But you're right, you are leaving your home and you are going to your husband's family's home, and you now serve your husband, all the people in the house, and your mother-in-law. So talk about, it's a big task. And how old?
15.
15, yeah.
Yeah, so, these girls would go into arranged marriages. These were, often started being planned when a girl was 8, 10 years old, that the whole betrothal would be decided, and, a good date would be looked for, people would be looking for, and gifts would be traded back and forth. It's a whole elaborate series of ceremonies that happen. But to me, when I think about this, to go at being 15, going sight unseen to your husband's home, and like the first time you ever meet this person you're going to spend the rest of your life with, you have to have sex with him. And I just think that would be so scary, and yes, you could say, oh, it's duty, and yes, this is everybody's agreed to it, and, but these girls didn't have any choice in it. They just were doing what other people were doing, providing for them on their behalf. But that seems okay sort of on paper, but if you think about the practicalities of what that would mean for a young girl, if that was what when you were going into that, I think it would be very scary. It would be scary for me.
There is the marriage bed, and you described it so well. It's something I had never heard of, and it was so well described, and I had such a good picture of it. And if you haven't figured this out, because I just figured it out last week, on your website, if you go through the website, it says, visit Lady Tan's world. See what she's talking about. You have your family's marriage bed.
Yeah. So for every book, I have something called Step Inside the World of, Tea Girl, Sea Women, and now this one, Lady Tan. And I have photos and videos and links to different articles about all of the historic backdrop of whatever that book is. And so this book was a very different one for me to write because I couldn't go to China, and everything was closed. So my whole research process was completely different. And I will say that by now I feel like I have a certain body of knowledge that I was able to draw on, and there were scholars literally all over the world who I would talk to on Zoom. I think that in their own way, they were as lonely and feeling like their life was over too, as I was. And so, you talk to the guy who, it's the mail system, or, how to, there was one professor at Harvard who, he's like God. No kidding. He's like the guy. for Chinese history. And he was like, oh yeah, I'll talk to you on Zoom. And we had all these conversations. And I even have in the afterward just one of the emails he sent me. You know, he spent a lot of time. But I also think he must have really been as lonely as I was. So anyway.
That worked out for you.
Yeah.
He had time on his hands.
He had time on his hands, just like I did. So anyway, I was able to do all of that, but this is the first book where I've actually used a particular object, and this one was the marriage bed. And so, often when usually when an elite girl would go into marriage, she had a big dowry, right? And all of these things would go to her husband's home, including a marriage bed, which was basically a sleeping platform with carved wooden walls around it that could be taken apart and then, just folded up into just about this high, really easy to transport. Well, in our family, we had a marriage bed, still have it, that was 3 rooms, and you carved from about 20 different types of wood. And so the first room, it had a big wooden canopy with these wooden tassels that hung down. You entered in the first room was where the servant slept on the floor. The next room was the dressing room. And then you entered through this very elaborately carved moon gate onto the sleeping platform that was surrounded on all sides by paintings on silk that showed scenes of domestic bliss. A couple walking by the stream, or she's playing an instrument, he's writing love poetry. This was my playhouse when I was a child. And this is where I played with all of my cousins, and where my sons played with their cousins. And once we get enough grandchildren around there, all those cousins will play together too.
Wow, and you're like, look at the cool pictures. It's a lot about fertility, happiness in marriage, other things. So I imagine some of the directors
they were very clean.
They were clean. It's
marital
beautiful.
Bliss. These are,
Yeah.
like really romantic moments, not sexy moments.
Right. But I always thought that was funny because after her really long days, and she sees a husband and wife walking along a stream, she's probably like, yeah, that was not today.
Yeah.
that was not part of today. The symbolism of that, and I mean, it's just a massive structure.
Yeah.
And it was just as big as I thought it was going to be. And the fact that they're trying to give you some privacy, and yet your servant is right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was really a new thing for me to consider. Not everyone's going to be there. The other thing that I think you do such a good it's such a good imagination, or how you describe these palatial estates, really, is these wonderful. I mean, it's sort of paradise, and she gets to go from what she thinks is like the nicest place she's ever lived
Right.
to something that is just beyond her wildest dreams.
Right.
How did you, and there are pictures of some of your inspirations, describe for people who haven't read the book what that would look like if we had walked into, let's talk about a little bit about her home that she grows up in. It sounds like they're sort of the same, but one's, like
It's
on steroids.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's sort of like the difference between a mansion and a McMansion.
Yeah, exactly.
Or a huge estate. And so, again, these were compounds where you would live with a lot of your husband's relatives, and there were courtyards, and the further you get in, the more private it is, the safer it is. At the very back is where the women's chambers are. That's the safest place. I have been to many of those houses in China over the years. Of course, her house no longer exists.
Okay.
And of course I couldn't go, but I have been in so many of those houses over the years that I had a really good sense. In fact, I will just tell you that when I was working on Dreams of Joy, and I knew I wanted part of it to take place in Anhui province, during the Great Leap Forward. And I was just literally looking at a map. Do I want to be by the river? Do I want to be in the mountains? Do I want to be here? And right then, I'm like looking at this map of where I want to go. Amy Tan called me. And she said, I've just been invited to stay in a 17th century villa in a small village in Anhui province. Do you want to come with me? I was like, yes, I do. And so off we went. And actually that house became the inspiration for the house in Dreams of Joy and in her book, Valley of Amazement. So you can always read those two books together and realize, man, that you did not want to live in that house. Because it's really nice to say 17th century villa. You kind of imagine like a Tuscan villa, no windows, no heating, no water. It was freezing. We were so cold when we were there. But anyway, so I've been in a lot of houses like that. And way back, this was back when I was writing the mysteries, there was one time I was coming back from the interior and back to Beijing, and the driver said, I want to show you this house. And so we stopped, and it was the house of a former salt merchant. And, and you can look this up online, something like 55 bedrooms. I mean, it was just huge. And I was walking around this place, and I'm thinking, this looks vaguely familiar to me. And it's because it was used in the filming of Raise the Red Lantern, if any of you have ever seen that movie. And actually, when I've been out on book tour, there was someone who came who was a descendant from that family.
Really?
Yeah, the Chow family. Yeah, so that and then not every house had a private garden, but I was very much inspired by the gardens in Suzhou, particularly the humble administrator's garden, which in Los Angeles, if you have ever been to the Huntington Library and Garden, they have a beautiful Chinese garden that's modeled on the humble administrator's garden. And both of those, I've spent plenty of time in Suzhou, but a lot of time in the Huntington Garden. So, even though I couldn't go certain places, I was able to draw on things that I had already been to, and even, and this was still during the pandemic, but finally the Huntington opened and they let just a few people in every day, and I got to go over and just spend time in there again with hardly any people there.
Yeah, there's a picture of you. You're wearing a mask, and I think they said your first outing.
It was my first outing. It was our very
and it
first
really
outing.
is beautiful. And it again, you're so good at describing things that when you see the picture, how often do you read a book and then you see a picture and you think, oh, it's not what I thought it was. This just really, it's absolutely gorgeous and pristine. She gets a lot of comfort in that garden as well. She can't go outside, but she can go and sort of spend some time there. That's a lovely place that a lot of cool things happen.
Yeah, and I think until you just said that, I think that may have been partly the pandemic, influencing me, because I personally got a lot of comfort from nature in those times. I mean, that was one of the only things we could do, right? Was go for a walk, whether it was in your neighborhood or I remember when they closed all of our parks in Los Angeles, so that was out the window. But, just to even see the ocean or go different places where you were out and getting fresh air, and there was something about nature that felt very healing, and certainly the sound of water and, the wind through the trees. And I think that must have, my own experience of that time must have seeped in.
And it works very well because a lot of the medicine or the things that they're doing is all related to, like you said, your feelings and your disposition and, the yin
balance,
and the yang, the balance. And so that really played in nicely, and you could see how that balanced her. How are we doing on time? Okay, I can see the clock there. How long do we have? Oh, 5 minutes, and then we'll go to questions. Those of you who wrote down questions, thank you. I will try to get to as many as we can. In this last part, though, I know we can't ask you to pick your favorite book because that would be not fair. But one of the books, and I do believe it would have been the book you talked about had we been able, if we hadn't had a pandemic and we had you there, real quickly, because there is talk that it could be becoming a series. But the other book that you wrote that is getting a whole bunch of buzz, and that is, tell me the title.
Sorry. Island of Sea Women.
Island of Sea Women. That's next on my list to read.
So
Has anyone read that? Okay, now we're talking. Good, I hope you wrote some questions about that one because I haven't read it.
So actually I have 3 things that are in different stages of development.
Okay.
So Island of Sea Women is in development in South Korea to be a television series. We'll see what happens. But, you know, hopefully we'll get to see it on Netflix. Please. Actually, while I was out on book tour, I sent the treatment for a project for Tea-Girl of Hummingbird Lane, also as a TV show, with all kinds of, what they call like a lookbook, you know, with all these images. There's a writer's strike, who knows when that will ever happen. And then Snowflower and the Secret Fan was made into a really bad film. But there's a Broadway producer who wants to do it as a musical.
That's kind of cool.
So we'll see. So we were able to get back the rights, and we'll see what happens. But, you know, there is a saying in Hollywood, what is it? Many are chosen, but few are made. And I just sort of take it like that. You know, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't, but it's sort of fun along the way.
And I have talked to authors. It's really kind of a love-hate feeling, because you are giving up, you know, what you created. And you only have, you know, they can say, oh, we're going to consult you, we'd like you to help, but it can go, as you said, it can go terribly wrong. I mean, that is it's a lot.
Yeah, but you know, I'll just say this very quickly.
Yeah.
When Snowflower and the Secret Fan was being developed, and you could tell pretty early it was going to be a disaster. I mean, you could just tell. And they were sending me every version of the script, and we want to hear everything you have to say, and I would tell them, and then they just totally ignored me. And my mom was having surgery the day after the film came out, and we were waiting in the waiting room before you go into surgery, you know, I don't know what they call that. And my sister and I were reading the reviews, and they were so bad, but we were laughing so hard. The headline was, Snowflower and the Secret Fan film may be cure for insomnia. And the nurse kept coming in like, if you girls don't stop laughing, we're going to send you out. My mother was, oh, let them stay. This could be my last moment on earth. But anyway, in that lead up, we have a very old family friend who was, for many years, the head film critic for the LA Times. And I was saying, like, oh, you know, Kenny, I just don't know. And he said, well, you're just going to have to look at this like, oh my God, his name just went blank. Who wrote, Mildred Pierce, The Postman Always Rings Twice, James M. Cain. So, you know, he wrote all these classic, dark mysteries, and people would come up to him after they were made. And these are films now that we look back and say, these were classics. Mildred Pierce, The Postman Always Rings Twice, Double Indemnity. Mm-hmm. And they would say, how could you let them do that to your book? Mm-hmm. And he would always answer, they did nothing to my book. See, it's right there still on the shelf.
That is a good answer.
Yeah.
That's a good answer. Okay, we're going to bring up some questions. Amy, thanks. I'll come. Well, yeah, I can. Just making sure my mic was attached to me. Thank you so much. All right, this is when we bring out the readers. This is from Dot Ramson. What's your connection to the stories that you write? This is great because we didn't get into this. You have a fascinating story of your own.
Right, so do you think she means like, why am I writing about China? Probably, maybe.
Dot, where are you?
Where are you? Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So I actually grew up in a very large Chinese American family. My great-great-grandfather came to work on the railroad. And he was an herbalist. My great-grandfather came and stayed. He, eventually here had 4 wives, one of whom was white. This was back when it was against the law in California for Chinese down to a quarter to marry someone who was white in the state. We had miscegenation laws in 28 states against the Chinese. So my great-grandparents went to a lawyer who drew up a contract between 2 people as though they were forming a partnership. My grandparents went to Mexico to get married, and my own parents were only the second couple in our whole extended family to be legally married in the US. Anyway, so when I was a little girl, I mean, they first with this herb shop, then curios, then crotchless underwear for brothels, then Chinese
Bet you aren't going to
antiques.
get that at another book club.
And that business is still in business today. It's one of the oldest continuously owned, family-owned businesses in California. Too bad it wasn't Levi's.
Right.
But you know, when I was a kid, and this is back when people had really big families. So my great-grandfather had 12 children, his brother had 12 children, they all had a ton of children. So when I was a little kid, you know, I lived with my mother, and her family was tiny, but my father's family was huge, and we had about 400 relatives in Los Angeles alone. And so, you know, there were about a dozen people who looked like me, the majority still full Chinese, and then this little spectrum in between. And so when I looked around, what I saw were Chinese faces, what I experienced was Chinese culture, Chinese tradition, Chinese language, Chinese food, and that's why I write the kinds of books that I do.
I love that you talk about being in your family's around antiques and things, and like you said, crawling around the marriage bed and playing there. And Chinatown is, if you've been there, it is so amazingly vibrant and just it's breathtaking, and it's so lovely to see that culture continue and not just be, you know, a full assimilation. It's really something to behold. Okay, this is a good question. Do you drink tea?
Oh.
And if so, what is your favorite type?
So when I started writing Tea Girl of Hummingbird Lane, I was a big tea drinker. By the time I finished that book, I was a total tea snob. You know, I've been on book tour for a little over a month now. I travel with my own tea.
You do.
You know, and sometimes I'll be someplace, like actually this morning in the hotel, I asked them, like, what kind of tea do you have? And they told me, I said, I'll just have hot water. You know, but I love pu'er, which is what I wrote about in Tea Girl, but and you know, there's and I drink different types during the day. So there's the raw pu'er that I love to drink first thing in the morning. It's very light, it's very grassy, it's very astringent. And then as the day goes on, I like to drink tea that's the same leaf but aged. So I have a tea that was stored from 1975 in a Hong Kong basement. I have a tea that was harvested from a single 1,000-year-old tree. And so these are teas that when you drink them, they're very earthy, they're very, they taste, one of the ways it's described is they taste like antique wood. You know, maybe you like that taste, maybe you don't, but I find that. How would you
know what that tastes like?
But you can kind of imagine, it. But the other two teas that I really love are true jasmine tea, and these are two of the teas that they drink in the novel. So one is jasmine tea, and the other one is this, it's a kind of tea that, it's also a pu'er. There's a county or a little village in, I mean, you can get this from other parts of China, but a special village in Guangdong province where they grow, it's like a mandarin orange, it's really little, and then they hollow it out, dry it, stuff it with tea, dry it, put the little lid on. So when you see it, it's like this little perfect little orange, right? And then you crush it in your hand, put it in the teapot and pour hot water on it. And then with the jasmine, you know, I could go on forever about tea. It's just like,
I'm getting this.
I just want to say one thing, which was Bana Tea Company created a tea package for book clubs that were reading Tea Girl. But now they've created one for this book that it has the jasmine tea and this little specialty, and that's for book clubs. But this time she decided she'd make one for individuals because not everybody's in a book club. And so who doesn't like to curl up with a book and a nice cup of tea?
We just found the Christmas present we're giving all our friends.
Yeah.
That's fascinating, and I'm so glad. I was fascinated by that tea, the little mandarin orange.
Yeah, and it's so good. It's just really nice.
So this is a great question. Lisa, how does a white woman earn the trust of the Chinese, the Korean community, and others?
Well, you know, in Los Angeles, I think I'm very lucky that my first book was on Gold Mountain, because that does tell the story of my Chinese American family. I was trying to tell the history of the Chinese in America through the eyes of my family. And I did that so long ago. You know, there really wasn't very much out there at that time. And so I think and I was writing mostly about Los Angeles. Everybody there had known me since I was a little kid. You know, they would refer to me as the Lo Fan Noor, that's like a little white ghost girl. They knew, you know, they knew I belonged there,
Right.
but that's how they would refer to me. And so I think because of that acceptance from my own from Los Angeles, Chinatown, I just think that sort of spread. And but I will say Island of Sea Women was completely different. And to me, that was a very different type of research because it wasn't my culture. And it wasn't something I was just immediately familiar with. So actually, the way in for me with that book was going back to Confucius again, that South Korea is considered to be the most Confucian of all of the Asian countries.
Really?
And Confucius, one of the things he said was, when a girl obey your father, when a wife obey your husband, when a widow obey your son. I grew up with that. And so that's those kinds of beliefs are that main part of South Korea. But on this island of Jeju, they were following shamanism. The women completely rejected that. And that was my way in, was that total rejection of the kinds of things that I had to reject even as a child.
Fascinating. Okay, how different are the class systems in China today as opposed to the times that Lady Tan's Circle of Women story was written?
Well, that's a really interesting question because China has, the economy there has exploded. So, you know, I can remember even 20 years ago, there were, we'll say 25 years ago, economists saying, you know, in 100 years from now, China is going to be an economic juggernaut, or, you know, in 50 years, and then it was 25 years, and then all of a sudden it was now. And this is the second largest economy in the world, and they have, I think it's the second largest number of billionaires and millionaires after the United States. Of course, it's a population almost four times the size of the United States, so they should have, you know, more proportionally. But that also, that's just like here. That's what do we call
the 1%?
The 1%.
Yeah.
And then there's everybody else, and then there are all the people who are at the very bottom. And you know, China still has a true peasant class that is, you know, out there working really hard in the countryside, and they haven't. I think they've certainly in the since the early 1980s, since I've been going there, you can see that life has really changed in the countryside, but they are not living in the same way that someone in Beijing or Shanghai is. I mean, when I did research for Island of Sea Women, for Tigre of Hummingbird Lane, that area had only had electricity for about 10 years. They'd only had running water inside for just a couple of years. And I would ask, what was the first thing you bought when you started to make money? And the first thing, of course, was electricity. Then, you know, what was the next thing you bought? A television. I would ask women, what was the first thing you bought when you started to make money? A washing machine.
Oh. Yep.
And so, you know, we have to remember that I think it's still 48% of all women in the world still do not have access to indoor plumbing. And so that idea of all that, you just forget like hauling water to get clean and cooking and all of that water that is required to keep us all clean and keep all our clothes and linens and everything, that's still all handwork for almost 50% of the women in the world.
Yeah. What advice would you give to amateur writers that you wish you had heard earlier? P.S. You're the bomb.
Thank you. I like that. So actually, my mom was a writer and my mother's father was a writer. I'll say this really quick. So I learned from them to write 1,000 words a day. That's just 4 pages. If you can just do that 5 days a week, if you can do that 5 days a week, at the end of a week, you'll have 20 pages, which is a chapter. If you can't do that, just do 500 words. That's, at the end of a week, you'll have 10 pages. At the end of 2 weeks, you'll have a chapter. And that the only way you're going to do that is to put your rear end in the chair and do it.
That's good advice. You can always rewrite, but you have to have words on the page to rewrite.
Okay.
And this is from...
We're done.
Are we done?
Yes.
Okay, so sorry. I'm sorry, Talia Farrow Book Club, I did not get to your question. That's you? Okay, well, she'll be signing books. You can slip it in when she's signing.
Thank you, Duffie, for leading us through this discussion tonight. And thank you, Lisa, for sharing your enormous talent with us. These are fascinating books. I've got a lot of catching up to do. I'd also like to thank the library staff again for putting this event on. And of course, Karis Bookstore. And most of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight. You make these events possible. And we've learned a lot tonight. I've learned a lot tonight. I hope you have too. And I hope we see you back at many more events. Thank you all so much. Lisa will be signing books for you. If you would line up in front of the stage and use the steps on the far side, then you can avoid the podium. And try to make it as orderly as possible. And help yourself to more refreshments to take home with you. And in just a few seconds, I will be announcing the winners of the silent auction.